Scout Vesic Thane had spent 6 months studying humanity from concealed observation posts, cataloging every behavior his species' first contact protocols required him to document before formal contact could ever be authorized. And none of that careful, methodical preparation meant anything at all in the 4 seconds it took him to fall from a collapsing cliff edge in the Colorado Rockies, certain, with the particular clarity that comes only in the final moments before death, that no human would ever risk their own life to save a species they didn't even know existed. He was wrong, and the hand that caught his wrist belonged to a hiker named Tom Bellamy, who had no idea, in that instant, that he was holding onto anything other than another frightened stranger. The scouting mission had proceeded, for 6 careful months, exactly according to Vesic Thane's meticulous training. The Threxus Confederation's first contact protocol demanded extensive, unobserved study before any species could be formally approached, a methodology refined across dozens of successful contact scenarios that prioritized understanding a target civilization's genuine character before revealing the Confederation's presence at all. Vesic had spent those months in careful concealment across a dozen human settlements, his cloaking technology sophisticated enough to render him essentially invisible to conventional human detection, observing humanity's behavior with the patient, clinical thoroughness his considerable training demanded. His conclusions, compiled across 6 months of careful documentation, had been growing steadily more troubling. Humanity, by every metric his observation protocols prioritized, appeared to be exactly the kind of civilization the Confederation's contact doctrine specifically flagged as high risk. Their historical record showed extensive, well-documented violence, both between competing human factions and, more concerning to Vesic's analytical framework, toward other species entirely, a documented pattern of environmental exploitation and resource extraction that his training had taught him to associate with civilizations poorly suited for the kind of cooperative, mutually respectful contact the Confederation's protocols were specifically designed to establish. He had begun drafting a preliminary recommendation 3 weeks before the incident on the cliff, advising against formal contact entirely, at least until humanity demonstrated a level of collective behavioral maturity his 6 months of careful observation had, thus far, failed to convincingly identify. The Colorado Rockies had been his final observation site, a remote, sparsely populated region his mission parameters had flagged as useful for studying humanity's behavior in genuine isolation, away from the social pressures and performative courtesies his training suggested might distort his understanding of authentic human character. He had followed a hiking trail through terrain that his own species' physiology found genuinely challenging, thin atmosphere and uneven ground testing capabilities. His cloaked, careful movement had managed successfully for weeks, right up until a section of trail he had crossed safely twice before finally, catastrophically gave way beneath him. He fell without warning, the ground simply dissolving into loose scree and empty air, his cloaking technology's careful concealment doing absolutely nothing to prevent the very real, very physical consequence of a 40-foot drop onto jagged rock below. He had perhaps 2 seconds to process the specific, terminal certainty of his own death, calculating, with the strange clinical detachment that sometimes accompanies genuine crisis, that his cloaking field would likely fail upon impact regardless, that his body would be discovered eventually by human search teams, and that his careful, 6-month study of a species he had begun to genuinely doubt deserved further Confederation attention would end, appropriately enough, in a completely unwitnessed death that would teach his own people nothing further about the civilization he had traveled so far to understand. He had not accounted for Tom Bellamy, hiking the same trail 40 meters behind him, who had heard the sudden collapse of loose rock, and without any conscious deliberation his own mind would later be able to fully reconstruct, thrown himself toward the cliff edge, and caught a wrist he could not actually see gripping tight to something his hand had somehow found in Chinese letter, even as his rational mind struggled to process what, exactly, he was holding on to. "I've got you," Tom said, his voice carrying the particular strained urgency of someone whose body had committed to an action before his conscious mind had finished evaluating whether it made any sense at all. "I don't know what's happening right now, and I'm going to be honest. I can't actually see you, but I've got your arm and I am not letting go, so just hold on." Vesic Thane's cloaking field, damaged by the fall's violent impact against the cliff face, flickered erratically as Tom hauled him, with considerable effort and no small amount of confused, muttered commentary, back onto solid ground, revealing, in intermittent, stuttering bursts, the genuine alien form of the creature he had just risked his own footing on unstable terrain to save. Tom Bellamy stared at what his cloaking field's failure had finally revealed, a being clearly not human, clearly not any terrestrial species his considerable experience as a lifelong hiker and amateur naturalist had ever encountered, and found himself, in the specific, disorienting aftermath of having just saved a stranger's life, entirely unable to process the full scope of what he was actually looking at. "Okay," he said, after a long, stunned silence, still gripping Vesic's arm with the particular protective firmness of someone not yet willing to fully release a person he had just pulled back from a genuine, near-certain death. "I'm going to need you to explain some things to me. But first, are you hurt? Because whatever you are, that was a pretty serious fall and you're still bleeding from somewhere. So let's deal with that part first and figure out the rest after." Vesic Thane, 6 months into a careful study of human character that had, until this exact moment, produced increasingly troubling conclusions about a species his training had prepared him to view with considerable caution, found himself utterly without precedent for what was actually happening. "You saved my life," he said, his translator implant, damaged but still partially functional, rendering his words in halting, imperfect English. "You did not know what I was. You could not see me clearly. You risked your own safety on unstable ground to catch something you did not understand, without any indication of what species I belonged to or whether I represented any threat to you whatsoever." "I mean, yeah," Tom said, helping Vesic to a more stable seated position while assessing what appeared to be a serious injury to the alien's shoulder, with the careful, practical competence of someone who had taken considerably more wilderness first aid courses than the situation had ever previously required him to use. "Somebody's falling off a cliff. You don't really stop to ask a bunch of questions first. You just grab whatever you can grab and pull. I guess I figured out the questions could wait until after the pulling part was done." "Your species' historical record," Vesic said, struggling against both his injury and the genuine cognitive dissonance of watching his 6 months of careful, troubling conclusions collide directly with the immediate reality of a human stranger's unhesitating sacrifice. "Documents extensive violence, both internal conflict and exploitation of other species. My observation protocols identified this pattern as evidence of a civilization poorly suited for cooperative contact. Your action in this moment appears to directly contradict that assessment." Tom Bellamy, still processing the fact that he was apparently having this conversation with a genuine alien, while treating what he now recognized as a dislocated shoulder with supplies from his hiking pack, considered the alien's statement with more patience than the surreal circumstances probably warranted. "Look, I'm not going to pretend humans haven't done a lot of terrible things, historically and, honestly, right now too, plenty of it," he said, working carefully to stabilize the injury with the calm, methodical focus his training had prepared him for, even if nothing had prepared him for the specific circumstances currently requiring it. "I'm not going to sit here and defend all of that, because a lot of it doesn't have a good defense. But I don't think you can actually understand a species by only looking at the worst things it's ever done. You've got to look at what happens in the moments that actually matter too, The ones where somebody's in real trouble and there's no time to think it through, no time to calculate whether it's worth the risk. That's usually when you find out what people actually are, underneath all the complicated history. Most of us, when it really comes down to it, we're going to grab the hand. Doesn't matter whose hand it is. Vesic Thane spent the following hours, while Tom Bellamy carefully guided him down the mountain trail toward eventual medical attention. His own Confederation technology could ultimately provide once safely away from human observation, processing an encounter that fundamentally contradicted 6 months of careful, methodical study in a manner his considerable training had never prepared him to properly categorize. "You are aware," he said, as they descended through increasingly forested terrain, Tom's steady, patient support helping him navigate ground his injured shoulder made considerably more difficult to traverse, "that I represent a first contact scenario your species' governments have not yet been formally informed exists. My presence here violates no protocol on your species' part, as you had no knowledge of my existence, but my own Confederation's contact doctrine will require extensive review of this encounter." "I figured something like that might be the case, yeah," Tom said. "You want to tell me what happens next? Because I've got to be honest, this is way outside anything I ever expected to deal with on a Tuesday hike, and I'm trying to keep up as best I can." "I do not yet know what happens next," Vesic admitted, a genuine uncertainty entering his translated voice that his considerable diplomatic training had rarely required him to express so openly. "My preliminary assessment, developed across 6 months of careful observation, was prepared to recommend against formal Confederation contact with your species, based on concerns regarding your civilization's demonstrated capacity for violence and exploitation. That assessment now requires significant revision, based on an encounter I did not anticipate, and that my training did not adequately prepare me to properly weight against 6 months of considerably more troubling observations." Tom Bellamy considered this admission with the same careful, unhurried thoughtfulness he had brought to the actual physical rescue itself, understanding, with a clarity that surprised even himself, the genuine weight of what the alien scout was actually describing. "Can I tell you something?" he said, "that maybe helps explain the thing you're trying to figure out. I think you're probably right that we do plenty of terrible stuff as a species. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would just be lying to you, and I don't think that's a great way to start whatever this is. But I think the terrible stuff and the good stuff, they're not actually in competition with each other, the way maybe you're trying to weigh them right now. They're just both true at the same time about the same messy, complicated species. We've done genuinely awful things to each other and to this planet, and we've also, over and over again, in moments just like this one, chosen to risk everything we've got to save somebody or something we don't even understand yet. I don't think you can average those two things together and get some kind of clean, single verdict about what humanity actually is. I think you've just got to decide whether a species capable of both those things, the terrible and the genuinely selfless, deserves the chance to keep trying to be more of the second thing and less of the first. That's kind of the whole story of being human, if I'm being honest. We're always trying to get better at it. Some days we manage it better than others." Vesic Thane's formal report to the Threxus Confederation, submitted 3 weeks after the incident, following a recovery period he spent in careful, concealed observation, while healing from injuries his own species' medical technology, addressed considerably faster than human equivalents could have managed, represented a substantial, and within Confederation contact protocol circles, controversial revision of his original preliminary assessment. "My initial 6 months of observation produced a troubling picture of human civilization, one my training's analytical framework interpreted as strong evidence against recommending formal contact," he wrote. "This assessment was not inaccurate precisely. The historical and ongoing patterns of violence and exploitation I documented are genuine and well supported by extensive evidence. What my assessment failed to adequately account for, I now believe, is the equally genuine and equally significant pattern of unhesitating individual sacrifice that exists alongside those troubling historical patterns, sometimes within the very same individuals whose broader species history includes considerable documented harm. I experienced this pattern directly, in a moment of genuine personal crisis, when a human individual with no knowledge of my species' existence, no understanding of what he was risking his own safety to save, and no possible calculation of what benefit such an action might provide him, chose without hesitation to risk his own physical safety to prevent my death. I do not believe this single encounter definitively resolves the broader question of whether human civilization, considered in its full historical and ongoing complexity, meets Confederation contact protocols' established threshold for safe, mutually beneficial first contact. I believe, however, that my original assessment, based purely on historical documentation of collective human behavior, failed to adequately weight the significant evidence our contact protocols have historically underweighted across all target civilizations, evidence of individual moral character demonstrated in genuine, unscripted moments of crisis, when calculation gives way entirely to whatever a person actually is, underneath every consideration of risk or benefit. I recommend this specific gap in our contact protocol methodology receive further study, using this encounter as a foundational case example before any final determination regarding human contact proceeds. Tom Bellamy never saw Vesic Thane again after helping him to the trailhead that afternoon. The scout's careful, technologically assisted departure conducted with a discretion that left the hiker with no clear way to verify, in the weeks and months that followed, that the entire encounter hadn't simply been some kind of elaborate, inexplicable hallucination brought on by altitude and exhaustion. He told no one about the encounter, understanding, with the particular instinct of someone who had genuinely experienced something extraordinary, that the story would strain credibility past any reasonable point of belief, and content, in the end, simply to carry the memory privately, a strange and genuinely humbling reminder that the universe had turned out to be considerably larger and stranger than his ordinary Tuesday hikes had ever previously suggested it might be. He continued hiking that same trail regularly in the years that followed, and found himself, more often than his rational mind entirely understood, glancing toward that particular stretch of cliff edge with a quiet, private hope that he might someday encounter something impossible there again, not because he expected the specific circumstances to repeat themselves, but because the entire experience had left him with a conviction he found himself returning to often in quieter, more reflective moments. That somewhere out among all the vast, complicated uncertainty of what else might exist beyond his own small, familiar world, the simple, immediate choice to reach out and catch a falling stranger, without pausing to calculate whether they deserved the effort, remained, in the end, the truest and most important thing he had left to offer.